For the Emperor of China, the most spectacular examples of European technology were only curiosities. Even these. Like the Jesuits before them, the French brought clocks as gifts for the emperor to swell a collection that eventually totaled over 2,000. To the Europeans, these instruments embodied the notion of the clockwork universe. The clock was the symbol of the triumph of science. In China, these were simply toys. In England, King Charles II set up the Royal Greenwich Observatory in 1675 to improve the navigational ability of British fleets. The observatory bought 2 giant pendulum clocks, which offered a first step toward a solution of one of the key navigational problems facing European mariners. But these clocks were both too big and too delicate to go to sea. Latitude, how far north or south one is, can be solved simply using trigonometry. But fixing longitude, how far east or west a ship may be, requires knowledge of the exact time, and hence the need for a clock that could keep good time at sea. It was the clockmaker John Harrison who came up with a solution: double-balanced pendulums, which he incorporated on his first marine chronometer. With several more such innovations, Harrison eventually won a prize of £20,000, over $1 million in today's currency. Parliament had established this award for anyone who could solve the longitude problem, an example of the way in which the state cultivated scientific talent to attack the practical problems of the day. Harrison was a working man, and while England was hardly egalitarian, Harrison's skills earned him access to the highest levels of the scientific establishment, and they gave British ships the key to travel the world round. Such a goal was hardly a Confucian priority, and this kind of official support for practical research remained foreign to China. At the European trading bases in the port of Canton, the clash of cultures continued 200 years after the Jesuits first landed. Still, despite any claims to technological superiority, European traders were simply buying from China with gold or silver, and the Chinese were purchasing nothing in exchange. What the Europeans wanted was more equal trade, and this they could not get.
It's very hard for the Manchu Qing government to appreciate what's it got to do with us. I mean, you want trade, fine, come along. We'll give you as much trade as we think you deserve. But what's all this about equality between states for trading purposes and so on? How can you be equal to us? We're a great empire. You are simply a bunch of merchants representing a king somewhere, far, far away, and mostly irrelevant to what we need. That's the sort of background. And in that background, for the Europeans to keep knocking again and again, demanding to be let in to trade on equal terms, seem almost insulting and certainly irrelevant to the main needs of the empire.
Yet while European innovations were irrelevant to China, here in the pottery centers of Staffordshire, England, competition with Chinese products in the home market drove British technology forward. The leading innovator was Josiah Wedgwood. Wedgwood was a scientific enthusiast, an amateur. He experimented with new materials and invented different ceramics. In order to do this, he needed to know the precise temperature of his kilns. Like all potters, Wedgwood realized that clay shrinks at a fairly consistent rate when heated. So he devised this calibrated pyrometer, which links the shrinkage of a cylinder of clay to the heat of the kiln. For this invention, Wedgwood was elected to the Royal Society in 1783. And using such precision instruments, he was able to produce his stunningly beautiful jasperware. The idea of a potter being admitted into the aristocracy of scientists would seem odd today, but it did not then, for this was the scientific revolution in action. Wedgwood and his contemporaries had learned Newton's lesson that nature, even the production of fine pottery, was governed by laws, and that laws could be deduced by logic and experiment. But while men like Wedgwood pursued science, China retained its hold on the European imagination, offering an image of exotic romance, as in this picture of the emperor ritually plowing the first furrow of the year. In the great aristocratic houses of Europe, chinoiserie, the taste for Chinese art and design, was all the rage, and nowhere more spectacularly so than in the famous Chinese room at the Potsdam Palace in Dresden. At Woburn Abbey, rare Chinese deer still roam the grounds. And the Duke of Bedford, like many European aristocrats, even built his outbuildings here at Derry in the fashionable Chinese style. The Bedford family, in fact, was responsible for another import from China that was to have a major impact on English life.
In theory, it was the wife of the 7th Duke, Anna Maria, who invented this very English habit of taking tea in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. I suppose you had China tea. When did you drink it? She started to drink it in the afternoon, and that's where, in theory, the habit started from. Well, my family, I think, looking very much to a new form of business, to be involved in the business of the day, which one of them was the East India Company, and we married the granddaughter of the president of the East India Company, Sir Josiah Child, and as her dowry, she bought the shares in the East India Company and the shares in Child's Bank. And I think that's what suddenly got my ancestors keen in getting a little more commercial. And so they built 2 ships, and which obviously plied that trade. And as a result, I think also got those ships to bring the decorations that you see in this room and many others, and in particular the wallpaper that was made for the room in China in 1754. I think you had the opportunity not only to originate your own scenes, but also if you didn't think there was enough decoration on them, you could order from China extra butterflies or extra birds or extra flowers. I mean, it was a very forward marketing concept.
This love of decoration, of gaudy and magnificent toys, was characteristic of 18th century Europe. But these seemingly frivolous devices employed one of the most important technological developments of the 18th century, a clockwork mechanism for controlling complex movement. These gorgeous French mechanical dolls entertained aristocrats from the Palace of Versailles to the court of Beijing. The application of what was essentially a form of automation also drove the next phase of the Industrial Revolution, one that was to give European producers an ultimately unbeatable edge over their Chinese competitors. At Lyon, the center of the French silk industry, a group of innovative weavers applied this technology to manufacturing, to make them more competitive with the Chinese. Weaving patterns into silk fabric was both labor-intensive and slow. A weaver named Jean-Marie Jacquard came up with these punch cards to automate the process. The traditional method of silk weaving had been invented in China over 1,000 years ago and involved two men working the loom. The master weaver controlled the movement of the shuttle. To create the pattern, the long warp threads were lifted by the draw boy. However, to change designs, he had to learn thousands of new moves. The Jacquard cards made it possible to replace the draw boy. The ultimate step was to harness a source of power that would supplant human strength as well as human skills. With the application of such power, it becomes possible to replace the weaver himself. The first step was to harness the driving power of water. In the early 1700s, water power began to transform what had been a cottage industry into the foundation of England's extraordinary wealth and power. In the beginning, Britain's water wheels drove spinning machines that produced the long, strong warp threads of the loom. This is a scale model of the Loam brothers' water-powered silk spinning machine. John Loam stole the plans for the machine from Italian silk makers. The Loam brothers installed their new devices in a small mill building near Derby in 1719, creating one of the first true factories of the industrial age. The Loam brothers weren't the first ones to exploit water power. The Chinese had made use of water-driven technology 400 years earlier. Water power was even used to automate the spinning of cotton in the 14th century. But water-driven machinery did not spark an industrial revolution in China as it would in Europe, a concrete expression of the different priorities the two cultures possessed. While Europe's economy was driven by the notion of expansion, China did not respond to the lure of unlimited economic growth.
What was much more important was clever methods being applied to increase productivity in agriculture. Then the state was in favor of that. But anything beyond that, the state really looked upon as being totally irrelevant. In its place, this emphasis upon harmony and on moral order and so on engaged all the best brains in the country. And some of these best brains in their spare time did a bit of science and technology, but it was also regarded as a hobby and something you can enjoy, but nothing to do with the needs of the state. So again, it comes back to the nature of a strong bureaucratic state, philosophically strengthened by Confucianism, and feeling that they don't need science and technology for what they want to do. They've got the answers already. And why would you want to increase productivity that much when we already have enough?
In Europe, there was never enough. The huge water-driven machines in British factories opened the era of mass production. This extraordinary leap in the amount of goods England was able to turn out each year was unheard of, stunning. Compared to the hardships of life on the land, the Industrial Revolution seemed to offer unlimited wealth, and this mastery over nature seemed to some the fulfillment of God's promise to man. The Protestant work ethic was to play as important a role in legitimizing the values of the Industrial Revolution as Confucian concerns did in reinforcing the agrarian values of China. In practical terms, of course, the Industrial Revolution had profound human costs. Spinners and weavers in Britain had been independent craftsmen and women, working on their own machines in their own cottages. No more. The new factories transformed these independent contractors into wage laborers. The clock, rather than the pace of the seasons, governed their working lives. And the notion of the clockwork universe, envisioned by Isaac Newton's successors, expanded in the hands of the new industrialists to include human beings as well as the planets.
And you began to get mill-owner philosophers whose most advanced exponent was a man called Dr. Andrew Ure, who published a book called The Philosophy of Manufactures in 1835, who had this picture of a mill being a working automata in which the people were only sort of little bits and cogs of the whole great machine, and the object of the whole process was to make the humans as like pieces of machinery as possible. That also meant they had to be internally habituated to the measurement of work out in this way. And in this sense, you can see some of the features which some of the religious beliefs, particularly Methodism, took in this period as being part of the internalization of the new work discipline of the factory and the mill system.
For all its attendant human costs, the system worked. After spinning was mechanized, the loom was next. Water power drove the spinning machines, but a new invention, the steam engine, would power the great looms of Britain and transform not just England's economy, but that of the world as well. Cotton from the New World and the colonies in India flowed into England to be spun and woven into thread and cloth. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, the English textile industry was the largest and most productive the world had ever known. English textiles were traded around the world, even back to America and to India. But not to China. China maintained its traditional policy. It was willing to sell to European merchants, but not willing to buy from them. In 1793, King George III made one more attempt to crack the China market by negotiation. He sent Lord Macartney, loaded down with obligatory gifts, to try to persuade the Emperor Qianlong to permit Britain to sell its industrial goods in China. In keeping with time-honored customs, the British even brought the Emperor yet more clockwork. Despite this, Macartney failed. Qianlong said, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in abundance and lack no product within our borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactured goods of outside barbarians in exchange for our products." Qianlong died before the consequences of his decision came home to roost, never realizing that the British possessed a technology that could multiply the strength of their 10 millions to match that of 350 million Chinese. The British Industrial Revolution began with factories and water power, but it reached its height with the harnessing for the first time of chemical energy, steam engines driven by coal fires. James Watt's steam engine was the culmination of both the scientific and industrial revolutions. It was one of the first practical applications of the principles of thermodynamics, and it could deliver a steady flow of power to any machine to which it was attached. Watt's engine provided the first power source steady enough to drive the great looms of industrial Britain. And the virtually unlimited nature of steam power drove the construction of ever larger factories. Women and children, cheaper and more nimble than men, were drawn into the labor force. The extraordinary potential of steam transformed Britain as no technology had before. And unlike water power, steam was portable. It could move. George Stephenson and his son Robert helped launch the railroads when their rocket locomotive reached the fantastic speed of 18 miles per hour at the 1829 trials of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. The steam engine went to sea as well, freeing ships from the whims of wind and tide. Now the power of steam would carry the British to Asia in ever-increasing numbers. There was another technology that had a transforming effect on Britain in the first part of the 19th century, the production of ever higher quality iron, and later of steel. The Derby family of Coalbrookdale, England, came up with the techniques to produce cast iron cheaply, with the result that the face of Britain literally began to change. The Derbys constructed this magnificent structure over the River Severn, the world's first all-iron bridge. Cast iron had another use as well. The high quality of iron, available in great quantities, enabled the British to mass-produce ever more powerful cannon. With steam and modern weapons, the British now possessed an absolute military edge over the Chinese. But opium was the catalyst for conflict. The resin from the white opium poppy was a commonly used ingredient in the herbal compounds of Eastern medicine. But the extract of the poppy, administered in regular doses, was fiercely addictive, as the British discovered. The British East India Company took over local opium production and expanded it to industrial scale at their factories in Bengal. Opium proved to be the only product that the Chinese would purchase from the West, and they did so in such quantities that by the 1830s the Chinese paid out more silver for opium than all their exports brought in. The social impact was appalling. Corrupt officials turned a blind eye as the economy was drained. In 1839, the emperor sent an incorruptible official, Commissioner Lin, to stop the trade. Lin wrote to Queen Victoria saying, "Let us ask, where is your conscience? How can you bear to go further selling products injurious to others in order to fulfill your own insatiable desire?" Receiving no reply, Lin destroyed 21,000 chests of opium seized in Canton. As this Chinese feature film dramatizes, the British response was immediate. The First Opium War had begun. British gunboats equipped with the new technology born of the Industrial Revolution moved inexorably up the Yangtze River. The modern British cannon far superior to Chinese weapons made from bronze and bamboo. For 3 years, the British attacked almost at will, their steam-powered vessels enabling them to travel anywhere that could be reached by water. The British military made use of these, the same machines that made the English factories the most productive in the world, and the British Army and Navy the most feared force anywhere in Asia. The ultimate irony was that the Chinese, inventors of gunpowder, were defeated when foreigners turned their superior cannon against them. In the Treaty of Nanjing, the Chinese were compelled to pay an indemnity of $21 million and to open 5 European-controlled treaty ports for the China trade. Qianlong's boasts of self-sufficiency, Kangxi's sniff of superior knowledge, These were to be blown away again and again over the next decades by the cannon that a handful of outside barbarians had brought halfway round the world. What was striking was that up until the point of war, the Chinese didn't understand that they were losing the race, didn't even see that there was a race to be run. Yet in the 300 years since the Jesuits had first tried to convert the emperor with a little bit of science and the word of God, a Europe vastly different from the one that the Jesuits portrayed to the Chinese had emerged. Confucian priorities remained at odds with those of the European powers, but the foreign barbarians the Chinese once scorned now flew their flags over Chinese cities. The power the West brought to bear presented the Chinese with an inescapable dilemma: how to respond to the Western idea of progress, to learn enough about modern science and technology to defend themselves, yet remain Chinese. The answers to this question were to consume some of the best minds of China for decades. In some measure, they still do.